The dog smelled the money before a single boot ever crossed the threshold. It was the 28th of June, 2016, Miami Lakes, Florida. Northwest 169th Terrace was the kind of pristine, palm-lined suburban street where nothing ever happens. A quiet, gated block defined by clean driveways and polite neighbors. But outside a two-story house, painted the color of a ripe mango, a cash-sniffing dog from the Miami-Dade tactical narcotics team was losing its absolute mind. It was frantic, tearing at the exterior walls, intoxicated by a scent it could pull straight through the stucco and drywall. Inside that unremarkable home, hiding in the dark behind a false wall, sat $24 million in pure, vacuum-sealed cash. It was the largest cash seizure in the history of the department. A staggering, suffocating fortune stuffed into 24 orange, 5-gallon Home Depot buckets, guarded by a saint and triggered by a simple garden rake. Hollywood looked at this bust and decided it needed a firefight. In January 2026, Netflix released The Rip, starring Matt Damon and Ben Affleck, convincing millions of viewers that this fortune was bathed in blood, cartel assassins, and dirty agents. They lied. The truth is far darker, far more psychological, and deeply rooted in the paranoia of a man who won the game but couldn't afford to play it. This is the real story of four-year-old Luis Hernandez Gonzalez, a quiet garden store owner who became the teacher, supplier, and silent banker for an entire underground industry. It is the story of a man disciplined enough to build a massive fortune, only to become a prisoner to it. And it is the story of a room full of money that, by law, nobody was allowed to leave. The perfect neighbor is always the one hiding the deepest secrets, and Luis Hernandez Gonzalez was a masterclass in smiling silence. At 44 years old, Luis was the picture of suburban success. He lived behind the gates of Miami Lakes in a spacious, two-story house painted the color of a ripe mango. His neighbors described his family as nice, polite, and largely guarded. They waved, they smiled, and they told you absolutely nothing. But to understand Luis, you have to understand the invisible economy exploding inside ordinary houses across South Florida in the early 2000s. Marijuana had moved out of the swamps and fields. It moved indoors. Spare bedrooms became hydroponic gardens. Walk-in closets were transformed into hyper-efficient nurseries. Entire suburban homes were gutted down to the studs, illegally rewired to handle massive electrical loads, and converted into heavy-yield farms that never saw the sun. And every single one of those hidden residential farms required the exact same infrastructure: high-powered lights, ventilation fans, heavy-duty fertilizer, timers, water lines. Every piece of that equipment was perfectly legal to sell, and that gray area was exactly where Luis built his empire. He was the owner and operator of Blossom Experience, a garden supply store sitting in North Miami-Dade. On paper, its shelves were stocked for hobbyists and orchid lovers. In practice, detectives came to believe the business catered almost exclusively to Miami's robust, illegal marijuana growhouse industry. It was a tight, insulated family operation. His sister Salma, 12 years his junior, worked the counter right alongside him. But here is the core of the business model, the genius that made him indispensable. Selling a high-wattage lamp is not a crime. Selling an industrial fan is not a crime. But investigators eventually realized that Blossom Experience was not really selling hardware at all. It was selling knowledge. Growers from across the country reportedly traveled to that North Miami-Dade counter, not for the fertilizer, but for the man standing behind the register. They were paying for an expert who understood exactly how to turn a standard 3-bedroom, 2-bath house into an agricultural fortress worth more than the real estate itself. Law enforcement noticed early. The heat was there, circling him for 11 years without ever putting a single handcuff on his wrists. Back in 2005, Drug Enforcement Administration agents had Luis under surveillance. They reported that he explicitly discussed marijuana sales. The net seemed ready to close, but nothing happened. No raid, no charges, no arrest. Luis just walked right back behind the counter, and Blossom Experience kept growing. That was the first absolute sign of what he was becoming. He was not a street hustler who got lucky. He was a disciplined, careful man. And in the underground economy, careful men are the ones who end up with rooms full of money. He operated in the open, keeping regular retail hours. Open the store in the morning, sell legal products across the counter, give advice, answer the phone, close at night. No street corners, no violent crews, no gunmen. Just a quiet shop owner building an invisible fortune. But a business built on trust has a fatal flaw. It has 1,000 open doors. Sitting quietly in the background of this entire story, resting on the counter of Blossom Experience, was a simple store telephone. And the problem with being the undisputed expert of an illegal industry is that every customer, every caller, and every friendly voice on the other end of that line could be wearing a wire. Luis thought he was untouchable behind his retail counter, completely unaware that the store was no longer just selling the blueprint to an illegal empire, and the feds were finally listening. Cash is heavy, cash is loud, and in the world of illicit economies, the sheer physical, deafening weight of illegal cash is a death sentence. Luis Hernandez Gonzalez faced the exact same suffocating problem that every successful trafficker in history has eventually faced. The moment a physical dollar bill touches a bank, it leaves a footprint. American banking laws require financial institutions to automatically report any cash transaction above $10,000. To bypass this, federal prosecutors said that between 2010 and 2016, Luis pushed $17.7 million into the financial system through a relentless, exhausting stream of staggered deposits and money orders. Every single transaction was meticulously sized to slide just underneath the government's reporting line. Federal law calls this deliberate maneuver structuring. His own defense attorney would later refer to it by its street name, Smurfing, but there is a fatal limit to that game. You cannot smurf a $24 million fortune through a suburban garden store without lighting up every financial alarm in the country. The rest of the cash simply had to vanish. The execution of his vault was pure hardware store logic. Luis took massive stacks of $100 bills, locked them tight inside heat-sealed bags, and stuffed them into orange, 5-gallon Home Depot buckets. The Homer's all-purpose kind, the cheap plastic tubs sold for paint and drywall mud. 24 buckets in all. This vault was no afterthought. Investigators came to believe the secret attic compartment was actually built right into the mango-colored house during its initial construction. Behind the standard drywall sat a hidden room. The door was a false wall, and that false wall had a mechanical trigger. If you climbed into the stifling heat of the Miami insulation, you would find a simple gardening rake lying on the floor. Attached to the handle of that rake was a steel cable running directly into the wall. Lift the rake, pull the cable, and the drywall would quietly give way, sliding open to reveal a buried fortune. And standing guard in the hallway directly in front of this secret compartment was a statuette of Street Lazarus, the saint that countless Cuban families keep close for healing and protection, now posted like a sentry in front of millions in dirty money. Understand what that vault really was. It was a confession written in drywall. Every sealed bucket screamed the exact same truth. This is money I can never explain. Money I can never invest. Money I can never spend in the open. On paper, Luis was one of the richest criminals in Miami. In reality, he was trapped. He did not make the money work for him. He worked for the money. And the hubris of outsmarting the system was building. By the 2010s, he wasn't just outfitting the farms. Investigators realized he wanted the harvest too. In 2010, a confidential source secretly recorded Luis discussing cultivation techniques and blatantly offering to purchase a future crop. He survived that close call, slipping through the cracks once again, but he made the ultimate mistake. He expanded. The illicit pipeline stretched from the hidden bedrooms of South Florida all the way up to Tennessee, moving product grown cheap in Miami to be sold for a massive out-of-state premium. Authorities said Luis was involved in trafficking that marijuana to Tennessee alongside 2 other men. And when the growers in that distant pipeline ran into problems with their plants, Luis did what he always did. He picked up the telephone and he coached them. He thought he was just dispensing expert advice to trusted partners in the dark. What he didn't know was that the feds in Tennessee were already closing in on those Miami pot growers, and every single word of his coaching was landing dead center on a federal wiretap. The growers were arrested, the recording survived, and the chilling reality was that Luis's own voice had just handed the United States government the keys to his house. A rip is exactly what it sounds like. It is fast, aggressive, and definitive. In the blunt vocabulary of the Miami-Dade Police Department's Tactical Narcotics Team, a unit the cops simply called TNT a rip, means one thing: we are going to kick your door, we are going to rip your stuff, and we are going to take your stash. Leading the unit was Chris Casiano, a TNT supervisor, a hardened working narcotics cop, and a father whose young son, Jake, was just 5 or 6 years old that summer. Casiano and his team had spent their careers hunting down illicit money, but nothing could have prepared them for the sheer scale of the empire they were about to dismantle. The takedown moved in calculated, aggressive stages. First, they hit the front. Detectives raided Blossom Experience and cracked open a safe hidden inside the shop. When federal prosecutors later totaled the cash pulled from the garden store, it came out to over $665,000 in currency and $42,000 in money orders. For a modest suburban shop selling ventilation fans and fertilizer, that is not a rounding error. That is a massive shadow business hiding inside the first. But the store was just the appetizer. The store gave them the house. On the 28th of June 2016, Casiano's team rolled up to the mango-colored home on Northwest 169th Terrace with a search warrant. But before a single officer could even cross the threshold, the dog told them everything. The narcotics team's cash-sniffing dog began alerting fiercely outside the house. It was an unmistakable, frantic signal that an insane volume of currency was breathing through the walls. The handlers watched the dog lose its mind and immediately understood the stakes. They were not about to find thousands. They were about to find a mountain. Inside the house, the raid team systematically tore through the rooms. Detectives climbed up into the sweltering heat of the attic, wading through the thick fiberglass insulation, and there they found it. A simple gardening rake resting on the floor, with a thick steel cable running from its handle straight into the drywall. Nobody stores a rake in an attic. Somebody hides a handle in one. An officer gripped the rake and lifted. The steel cable pulled taut, the drywall shifted, and the false wall swung heavily away to expose a pitch-black hidden room. Stacked floor to ceiling in the dark were the buckets. 24 orange, 5-gallon Home Depot buckets, packed to the lids with heat-sealed bricks of $100 bills. Officers had to bring up sledgehammers just to break through the remaining wall and physically pull the massive tubs free. Downstairs, the secrets kept bleeding out. Street Lazarus kept his post in the hallway, the saint of the sick and the poor, standing silent watch over more dirty cash than most banks hold in their concrete vaults. Alongside the money, the search turned up heavily guarded contraband. Premium marijuana strains explicitly labeled Chernobyl and Super Skunk, 4 different types of antibiotic steroids, and a loaded TEC-9 firearm. Casiano walked through the rooms and noticed something else chilling. Cameras. He immediately spotted lenses tracking their movements and got the distinct, creeping feeling that his tactical team was being watched in real time. Then came the psychological crucible, the part of the raid that Hollywood turned into its entire plot. By law, officers are required to count seized cash on the scene, by hand, twice. It is a grueling, exhausting rule, built to protect cops from the exact accusation everyone in that room is silently thinking. So they counted, bundle by bundle, bucket by bucket, hour after hour. By one account, the manual count took investigators 42 agonizing hours. The final numbers were staggering, though the press scrambled to nail them down. The Miami Herald reported $22 million stuffed in the buckets, plus the more than $600,000 from the business, while other outlets put the total at $24 million. Federal prosecutors officially logged over $21 million seized from the residence alone. However you slice the arithmetic, it was the largest cash seizure in the history of the Miami-Dade Police Department. Casiano put it plainly to a friend years later. "That amount of money," he said, "does dark things to the soul." His underpaid team stared directly into an ungodly fortune for the better part of 2 days, and they walked out completely clean. After 11 years of government surveillance, Luis Hernandez Gonzalez was finally walked out of his home in handcuffs. He was slapped with severe state court charges: money laundering, cannabis trafficking, conspiracy, and a weapons count. His sister, Salma, was arrested right alongside him. His empire was shattered. The cash was gone. It looked like the ultimate victory for law enforcement. But the justice system is a machine built on paper, not justice. And Luis was about to exploit a shocking legal loophole that would change the ending of this story forever. The jaw-dropping reality of the American justice system is that the biggest kingpin in Miami did not fall in a hail of gunfire. He fell to bank paperwork, and he walked away a multi-millionaire. When Luis Hernandez Gonzalez was dragged out of his mango-colored house in handcuffs, the state of Florida thought they had the ultimate drug case. He was facing severe state charges for cannabis trafficking, conspiracy, money laundering, and a weapons count. But drug cases are notoriously messy. They require proving where the plants came from, where they went, and who touched them. The federal government, however, operates on a completely different frequency. They do not care about the plants, they care about the math. While state prosecutors were busy looking at the marijuana strains labeled Chernobyl and Super Skunk, federal postal inspectors were quietly unearthing a massive, undeniable paper trail. They tracked the suspicious bank deposits. They traced the money orders. They mapped out the agonizingly repetitive Smurfing campaign where Luis pushed millions into the financial system, keeping every single deposit perfectly under the $10,000 reporting threshold. The state had a drug problem. The feds had a math equation, and math does not require witnesses. Faced with an overwhelming federal indictment for money laundering and structuring, the architect of this invisible empire saw the walls closing in. He was looking at a maximum sentence of 30 years in federal prison. But the justice system is a machine of negotiation, and Luis made a calculation. On the 7th of February 2018, he walked into a courtroom and took a plea deal that is still staggering to comprehend. He pleaded guilty to federal money laundering and structuring charges. In exchange, the government dropped every single drug charge. Furthermore, as part of this monumental agreement, Luis agreed to forfeit more than $18 million to the United States government. But look closely at the math, because this is where the system reveals its true face. The government seized roughly $24 million. By forfeiting $18 million, Luis Hernandez Gonzalez was legally permitted to keep $4 million in cash. But it did not end there. The deal allowed him to keep his sprawling home in Miami Lakes. It allowed him to keep Blossom Experience, the very hydroponic supply store where the empire began. And he even got to keep his 5 luxury Rolex watches. His sentencing was originally scheduled for the 20th of April 2018. Of all the dates on a calendar, the court unintentionally chose 4/20, the universal holiday of cannabis culture, to sentence a man who built a fortune supplying its growers. The date was eventually moved, and on the 25th of April 2018, Luis stood before a federal judge. He was sentenced to just 65 months in prison. 5 years and 5 months. Sit with the absolute gravity of that outcome. The man at the dead center of the largest cash seizure the Miami-Dade Police Department had ever executed. A man who literally hid a mountain of dirty money behind a mechanical false wall has never been convicted of a single drug crime. He became a federal case study in how modern kingpins actually fall. Not through informants holding guns to their heads, and not through high-speed chases. They fall through bank paperwork and a telephone they never should have answered. While Luis headed off to serve a fraction of a sentence, the men who dismantled his empire went back to the grind. Chris Casiano, the tactical narcotics team supervisor who stared into the soul of that buried fortune, stayed on the job. But life dealt him a blow that no violent raid ever could. His young son Jake, who was just a little boy when the rip went down, was diagnosed with leukemia. In 2021, at just 11 years old, Jake passed away. Casiano carried the weight of that loss, and he carried the surreal memory of the June 2016 raid. Around 2020, while working on a project, he told the story of that insane night to a close friend, the filmmaker Joe Carnahan. Carnahan could not let it go. The imagery of the buckets, the rake, the saint, and the suffocating volume of cash haunted him. He carried the concept for years until Hollywood finally bit. In June 2024, the film adaptation was officially announced, with A-listers Matt Damon and Ben Affleck attached to the project. Titled The Rip, the movie eventually landed on Netflix on the 16th of January 2026. At the end of the credits, a quiet dedication flashed on the screen. For Jake. But Hollywood is incapable of telling a story without bathing it in blood. The fiction they created was so deeply cynical and so profoundly dark that it circled all the way back around and wounded the real heroes. By the time the movie dropped, The Miami-Dade Police Department no longer existed by that name. It had been reorganized and rebranded as the Miami-Dade Sheriff's Office. In May 2026, the fallout from the film reached a boiling point. Two deputies from the agency filed a massive defamation lawsuit against Matt Damon and Ben Affleck, claiming the blockbuster movie intentionally made them look like violently dirty cops. The final verdict on the movie cuts both ways, because it is a masterclass in distortion. The filmmakers got the strangest, most unbelievable details exactly right. The orange Home Depot buckets in the hidden attic room were completely real. The false wall triggered by a steel cable was real. The frantic cash-sniffing dog losing its mind outside the stucco was real. The grueling regulation about counting the money on the scene twice by hand, and even the creeping paranoia of the security cameras tracking the cops, all came straight from Casiano's visceral memory of that night. But the movie stripped away the truth to sell a lie. It moved the house from the quiet suburbs of Miami Lakes to the gritty streets of Hialeah. It swapped out a localized Cuban marijuana growhouse network for violent cartel ties, inventing a neighborhood bought out entirely to guard the stash. Most unforgivably, it invented a murdered police captain, a notoriously crooked federal agent, and a massive, bloody gunfight over the money. The real bust involved absolutely no dirty police. There were no shootouts in the street. There was zero corruption. And that is the biggest, most tragic distortion of them all. The movie wants you to believe that money inevitably turns lawmen into thieves. The historical record explicitly says that $24 million sat in a sweltering room full of exhausted, underpaid cops for 2 grueling days. And when the dust settled, every single $100 bill was still there. Luis Hernandez Gonzalez spent a lifetime meticulously building a fortune he could never openly spend. The only bank he ever truly trusted was a sheet of drywall. In the end, the money did not corrupt the men who found it. It buried the man who owned it. If this story got under your skin, subscribe right now, because there is always another blockbuster film hiding a much darker, stranger true story underneath its glossy surface. Drop a comment below and tell me exactly which movie you want broken open next, because there is always another false wall, and there is always something bleeding behind it.